She wrote a letter for someone else, but he read it and saw her. For 10 years, Emily Harper avoided love like it was a room with no exit. She buried herself in work, convinced that people like her, quiet, steady, a little bit bruised, weren't meant for grand romance. Until one morning, a handwritten invitation to a blind date, a rare crack in her guarded heart, slipped from her hands and landed at the polished shoes of James Whittaker, her billionaire boss. He wasn't supposed to see it. He definitely wasn't supposed to feel something when he read it. But he did. What followed wasn't a scandal. It was a quiet unfolding of something deeper than either of them expected. If you've ever wondered whether your quiet life could still hold something extraordinary, this story is for you. Leave a comment if this story touches something inside you. Your words matter more than you know. Now, come closer. This story doesn't shout. It whispers. And it begins with a letter that found the wrong hands at exactly the right moment. Some things fall by accident. Others fall into the hands of fate. Emily Harper believed it would be an ordinary Friday. She rose at 6:15 just as she had every weekday for the past 8 years. The coffee brewed as she packed her usual lunch turkey sandwich, apple slices, and 2 chocolate chip cookies she made from her mother's old recipe. The radio murmured softly in the background, reading the morning headlines she never quite listened to. His routine had become her refuge. The Charleston sky was pale blue, brushed with pink at the edges, the kind of sky that hinted at the promise of autumn. Emily wrapped her cardigan tighter around her arms as she walked briskly toward the towering brick building of Whittaker and Knox Law Group, a place where names mattered, and hers rarely did. But today, something felt off, not wrong, just unfamiliar. In her purse, tucked carefully between her planner and a dog-eared copy of Little Women, was a small ivory envelope, handwritten, sealed, the kind of envelope that carried weight far beyond its paper. It was a blind date invitation, a handwritten note she had poured over the night before, rewriting lines 3 times until they felt honest but not desperate, thoughtful but not rehearsed. Her best friend, Daniel Brooks, had convinced her to let him set it up. You deserve to be seen, Em, really seen. And so, after 3 years of declining, deflecting, and making quiet peace with solitude, she said yes. Her heels clicked lightly against the marble lobby floor as she entered the building. She offered a small nod to Marvin, the security guard, and handed him the extra apple muffin she'd brought for him, just like every Friday. "Thank you, Ms. Harper," he said, smiling. "You sure know how to keep an old man's blood sugar up." She smiled back but kept moving. It was already 7:48. If she timed it right, she could reach the office before the elevators got crowded with a Zeta rush. Inside the elevator, Emily exhaled, alone. Good. She leaned slightly against the mirrored wall, her purse resting loosely on her shoulder, the coffee cup warm between her palms. Floor 10, floor 11, floor 12, and then, just before the doors opened on 13, a small jolt. The elevator hiccuped, the kind of soft mechanical stutter that didn't alarm anyone, but made your stomach flutter for a second. It was enough. Her purse slipped off her shoulder. The sudden shift tilted her coffee dangerously forward. She reached too late. The ivory envelope floated free, as if caught in a slow-motion breeze. It turned once in the air, then again, and drifted downward, delicate and deliberate, until it landed at the polished leather shoes of a man who had just stepped in. James Whittaker. Emily's heart froze. There he was, in person. The CEO. The man whose name was etched on every wall plaque, whose portrait hung in the executive wing, whose voice carried calm authority through every company video and all-hands meeting. He rarely used the employee elevators. Rumor had it he had his own private one, along with a private parking space, private office floor, and a private world far from hers. He was taller than she remembered from his occasional cameos at company functions, taller and quieter. His suit was dark gray, perfectly tailored, and his gaze distant until now. The moment he bent down and picked up the envelope, time fractured. Emily's cheeks flared hot. Her hand trembled as she reached toward him. "I think you dropped this," he said. His voice was softer than expected, not cold, thoughtful. She'd heard it before through speakers and screens, but never like this, never close enough to feel it echo in her ribs. And then he looked down. His eyes caught the envelope in his hand, turning it slightly. His fingers traced the cursive handwriting on the front. "To someone who still believes in quiet beginnings and second chances." He didn't say anything else, but his brow lifted ever so slightly like the line had caught him off guard. Emily's mouth went dry. She wanted to explain, to say it was for someone else, that it wasn't meant for him, that it was a silly thing her friend set up and didn't matter much at all, but the words stuck somewhere in her throat. The elevator began its slow climb again. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. 2 junior associates stood behind them, scrolling their phones, oblivious to the strange, fragile exchange playing out at the front of the elevator. James looked up from the envelope. Their eyes met. Emily had no idea what he saw. A secretary with flushed cheeks, a coffee-stained sleeve, a broken routine. He didn't return the envelope right away. The elevator dinged, floor 14. Another pause. Finally, at floor 15, her floor, Emily stepped forward. James extended the envelope, and their fingers brushed, just barely. Something like static, or recognition. "Thank you," she whispered, barely above the hum of the elevator. He nodded, no smile, just the faintest tilt of his head, as if filing away a moment for later. As the door slid closed behind her, Emily stood in the hallway for a moment, the envelope pressed tightly in her palm, her heart still racing. She didn't know if he'd read the note inside. She didn't know if he'd remember her name tomorrow. But she did know one thing. Something had shifted, and she wasn't sure it could be undone. You think you know your boss, until he starts reading the words you never meant for him. James Whitaker stepped into his office on the 24th floor and closed the door behind him with a gentle click. The hum of early morning emails, ringing phones, and hallway chatter faded to silence. He liked silence, needed it, even. The view from his window stretched out across Charleston Harbor, where sailboats bobbed and a line of gray-blue horizon met the sky. It was a view that impressed most visitors. To James, it had long become just another part of the background, a still frame in a life that moved too fast. He set his leather briefcase down, loosened his tie, and sat at the edge of his desk. And then, he looked at the envelope. It was still in his hand. He hadn't meant to keep it. He should have handed it back immediately with polite disinterest or a casual nod. But something in the handwriting had caught him. It wasn't the elegance of it. It was the honesty, the tenderness. The phrase on the front still echoed in his mind, to someone who still believes in quiet beginnings and second chances. He exhaled, long and slow. As he opened the flap, inside was a folded note, written on cream stationery. The ink flowed in a steady hand, not rushed, not guarded, thoughtful. James read it once, then again, slower. It wasn't a traditional date invitation, not the kind laced with flirty lines or artificial charm. It was more like a letter, a confession. The woman Emily. He now remembered her name described the person the invitation was intended for, a friend of a friend. She hoped he would be kind, emotionally present, someone who didn't mind long silences or walks in the cold. She mentioned that she read classic novels and preferred bookstores to bars, that she had been on exactly 3 dates in 4 years and didn't regret any of them because each one taught her a little more about herself. Then there was a line that stayed with him. "I'm not looking for fireworks, just someone who still believes in warm soup, open doors, and words that are meant." James set the letter down on his desk, his thumb resting on the edge of the paper. He stared at it for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. He hadn't planned to think about anyone this morning, certainly not her, and yet, the letter tugged at something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time, something tender, almost fragile. Truthfully, James had noticed Emily Harper before, not in any inappropriate way, never that, but in the way a man notices quiet things when the world around him grows too loud. She moved through the office like a gentle breeze, never drawing attention, never demanding space, but somehow leaving things better than they were. He'd seen her adjust a crooked frame in the hallway, offer her umbrella to a junior associate caught in the rain, bring extra napkins to the break room when no one asked. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays without a calendar. He hadn't known her name until now, but he'd noticed her, more than he cared to admit. James looked back at the letter. His fingers traced the handwriting again, slower this time. And that's when the thought crept in, quiet, unexpected, and slightly absurd. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if that letter had found its way to him for a reason? He opened his laptop, hesitated, then typed in a few names. Daniel Brooks. There he was, a freelance graphic designer based in Mount Pleasant, and listed as a mutual connection to Emily Harper through her social media. The dots connected easily. James's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the profile. Then he reached for his phone. He held it in his hand for a full minute before unlocking the screen. This wasn't his style. He didn't interfere in personal matters. He didn't cross boundaries. His world was made of contracts, mergers, and negotiation tables, not blind dates and handwritten notes. And yet, he opened a new message, typed, then deleted, typed again, finally. He settled on 12 words, simple, clear. Would you mind letting me take your place tonight? He stared at the message for 5 full seconds, then pressed send. The message disappeared into the digital ether. He leaned back in his chair and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe Daniel would ignore it. Maybe he'd think it was a joke. Or maybe he would say yes. In a world that moves too fast, kindness is often invisible, but not to everyone. The Monday after the elevator incident passed without event. So did Tuesday. No sudden changes, no unexpected messages, no whispered rumors in the hallways, just the quiet hum of routine staplers clicking, printers whirring, footsteps echoing down marble floors. And yet, for James Whitaker, something had shifted. He found himself watching more closely, not in a way that breached professionalism, but in that quiet, inward way one notices the texture of things after it rains clearer, softer, more alive. It started with a comment from his assistant, Monica, Emily Harper. She's the one who brings muffins to the security guards, right? Monica had said it in passing, while discussing an upcoming company appreciation event. She's always doing those little things no one asks her to. Doesn't even put her name on the sign-up sheets for potlucks. Just leaves food in the break room like it appeared by magic. James nodded, pretending it was a useful detail for the committee list. But the next morning, he stood for a moment just outside the glass pane separating his office hallway from the central lobby. And he saw her. Emily Harper, hair pulled back in that no-nonsense way she always wore it. Her cardigan sleeves slightly rolled, balancing 2 lunch containers in one hand while greeting Marvin, the morning security guard, with the other. You remembered I liked the cranberry walnut, Marvin said, surprised. You said it once back in March, she replied, smiling. I pay attention. She placed the second container beside him. And this one's for Deshawn. He works late tonight. Then she was gone, back into the flow of the day, unnoticed by most, but not by James. That afternoon, he passed the community bulletin board by the staff lounge. One corner had slipped from its tack and hung awkwardly. As he turned to call maintenance, he paused. There she was again. Without hesitation, Emily walked up, straightened the frame, smoothed the flyers, and pinned the edge back in place with a fresh pushpin from her own desk drawer. She didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. She didn't seem to need credit. She just fixed it. Something stirred in James, then something oddly specific and deeply unexpected. He remembered a line from her letter. I believe small gestures carry the loudest truths. It echoed in his mind like a chime in an empty chapel. The next day, Monica mentioned a personnel shuffle in the admin team. A junior coordinator had to take time off. Her mother was undergoing surgery out of state. Emily had quietly taken on the bulk of her work without asking for overtime or credit. When HR inquired about coverage, they'd assumed a full team had stepped in. But it had been one person. James sat with that thought for a long time. He thought of all the people in his world who were loud, the deal makers, the attention seekers, the ones who knew how to command a room. And then he thought of Emily, a woman whose strength lived in quiet spaces. Not long after, James reviewed a list of quarterly commendations, names nominated by peers for exceptional performance. Emily's name wasn't on it, not because she hadn't earned it, but because she hadn't been nominated. And somehow, that bothered him more than he expected. That night, as he sat in his study, the harbor lights twinkling faintly beyond his tall windows, he pulled the letter out again. His fingers brushed the crease in the paper, now slightly worn from being opened more than once. He read it slowly, letting each sentence settle. No one had written to him like that in years. No one had risked honesty without an agenda. She hadn't known he would read it that made it purer somehow. Like finding a message in a bottle, warm soup, open doors, words that are meant. He closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair. He had all the trappings of success, the position, the wealth, the freedom, and yet, sitting in the silence of his own home. James had never felt the absence of connection quite as deeply. He reached for his phone and opened his calendar. Then, with slow precision, he booked a reservation, table for 2, River and Oak, Friday, 7:00 p.m., corner table by the water, if available. He'd chosen the restaurant with care, the very one mentioned in her letter. Emily had described it as her dream setting for a first date, with candles on each table and live jazz on weekends. A place where conversation didn't need to compete with noise. He could have chosen a high-end venue, something dramatic or impressive. But this wasn't about that. This wasn't a power move. This was something else. He paused before closing the app, rereading the reservation details. For the first time in what felt like forever, James felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not apprehension, not anxiety, anticipation. Like he was stepping onto a bridge whose other end he couldn't quite see but knew he had to cross. She thought she was meeting a stranger, but someone she'd seen only from afar was already waiting. Emily Harper stood outside the glowing windows of River and Oak, smoothing down the front of her cardigan for the third time in as many minutes. The restaurant was nestled just off the historic district, where the air carried a hint of salt from the nearby harbor, and the sidewalks gleamed faintly from a recent drizzle. A wrought iron sign creaked gently in the breeze above the door, as if whispering to her, "You can still turn around." She almost did. But then she remembered Daniel's voice from the voicemail he'd left earlier that week. "This guy's great. Low-key, kind, a little quiet, like you. I think you'll get along just fine." And so, she stepped inside. The soft jazz playing near the back mingled with the quiet murmur of Friday night diners. Tables were dressed in white linen, lit by the flicker of tea lights. The warm lighting made everything feel a little softer, like the world had taken a deep breath and exhaled in candlelight. A hostess greeted her with a practiced smile. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Emily replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It should be under Brooks." "Daniel Brooks." The hostess scanned the list and nodded. "Of course. Right this way." As she followed the woman past clinking wine glasses and soft conversation, Emily rehearsed polite conversation in her mind, ask about his work, comment on the food, maybe compliment his shirt if it felt natural. She didn't expect sparks. She didn't even expect much comfort. Just maybe a decent evening with someone who wasn't trying too hard. But as they neared the corner table by the window, her steps slowed. A man sat there already, back straight, fingers resting gently on the stem of a wine glass. Not Daniel, not even close. Her heart stuttered. It was James Whitaker, the CEO, the man from the elevator, the man who had held her envelope like it meant something. He looked up as the hostess gestured toward the table. His eyes met Emily's with a calm steadiness, not surprise, as if he had expected her all along. "This is your table," the hostess said with a warm nod. "Enjoy your evening." Emily didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her pulse roaring in her ears. Every instinct in her body whispered retreat. Something was wrong, off, impossible. This had to be a misunderstanding, or, worse, a joke. But James rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, and pulled out the seat across from him. He didn't smile, not fully, but there was a softness in his expression that she'd never seen in the clipped, formal version of him that existed in office memos and quarterly briefings. She blinked. Words refused to form. "Mr. Whitaker, I don't understand. I was supposed to meet someone else tonight." His voice was quiet, nearly drowned by the low notes of the jazz trio in the corner. "I know," he said. "Let me explain." Emily hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk out to put as much distance between herself and whatever this was as possible. She didn't like surprises, not like this, not from men with power and too many options. But there was something in his tone not commanding, not persuasive, almost uncertain. It stopped her, slowly, with a caution she hadn't felt since her college days. She lowered herself into the chair. James waited until she was seated before sitting again. Silence settled between them. Not awkward, exactly more like the kind that forms when two people are trying to figure out where they stand in a story neither of them expected to be part of. Emily folded her hands in her lap. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you here?" she asked. The words were not unkind, just careful, as if testing the strength of thin ice. He didn't rush his answer. "Because I read something," he said, "that I wasn't supposed to, and it made me realize I've forgotten what real honesty sounds like." She tilted her head, not convinced. "So, you decided to show up on a date that wasn't meant for you." "I asked permission first," he replied gently. "From Daniel. I told him what happened. He said he thought maybe it was better this way." Emily let out a small breath, half disbelief, half something else. "You read my letter." He nodded once. "That was private, I know." They fell silent again. This time, the space was heavier, not hostile, but full of what-ifs. James looked down at the menu in front of him, though he clearly wasn't reading it. "I won't stay if this makes you uncomfortable," he said. "I just wanted to meet the woman who wrote those words." Emily's pulse steadied, just slightly. She wasn't sure what this was, but it didn't feel like a game. And the strange thing was, despite her confusion, despite every warning bell in her mind, a small part of her wasn't entirely opposed to staying. Not yet. She gave him 5 minutes. He used every second to open his heart. Emily Harper wasn't a woman who often made impulsive decisions. She scheduled her oil changes 3 months in advance. She knew what time to leave home each morning to catch the elevator without waiting. She even rotated her winter sweaters based on which ones had been worn most recently. But now, sitting across from James Whitaker in a restaurant where candles flickered softly between them, she was doing something entirely unscripted. She gave him 5 minutes. "I'll listen," she said quietly, fingers folded in her lap, "but just for 5 minutes." James nodded, his expression unreadable, yet somehow open. "Fair enough," he replied. Then he set his menu aside and leaned forward slightly, as though not wanting to waste a single breath. "I didn't plan this," he began. "When I picked up that envelope in the elevator, I thought it was something official, a contract, maybe, or a client document. But then I read the handwriting." His voice slowed there, and for a moment, Emily saw something unfamiliar in his eyes, not power, not polish, but something far more delicate. "Just the words on the outside," he continued. "To someone who still believes in quiet beginnings and second chances." I don't know why that line stopped me, but it did, and I couldn't not wonder, who would write something like that? Emily didn't speak. Her face was calm, but inside, her pulse thudded in her throat. James went on, "When I read the letter, I knew it wasn't meant for me. I knew I should have looked away, but it felt like I was reading something true. like every sentence was spoken out loud, even though it was written in ink. It wasn't just a date invitation. It was a piece of someone's life. He paused, not for effect, but as if searching for the right weight of the next words. I've spent most of my adult life surrounded by noise. Business meetings, deals, phone calls that last too long and say too little. People who speak in bullet points instead of full thoughts. His voice softened, but that letter didn't have noise. It had heart. Emily glanced down, unsure of what to do with his honesty. She felt the familiar pull to retreat to protect herself with quietness, politeness, distance, but something about the way he spoke unhurried, without armor, made her stay. James looked down briefly at his hands. "I didn't come here tonight to make anything happen," he said. "I came because reading your words made me realize how long it's been since I heard something genuine, not polished, not packaged, just real." He met her eyes again, and I thought, if that letter was a window into the person you are, then maybe 5 minutes with you would be worth more than 5 hours in any boardroom I've ever sat in. Silence, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just full. Emily took a slow sip of water, her fingers grazing the cool glass. She looked past him for a moment out the window where the river shimmered under moonlight. A boat passed slowly in the distance, its lights reflected in long, trembling streaks. When she turned back, her voice was softer. "Why would someone like you care about a letter from someone like me?" It wasn't a challenge, it was a question born from years of being overlooked. James shook his head gently. "I don't think that's the right question," he said, "because that letter could have come from anyone, and I still would have been moved. But knowing it came from you, someone who lives with intention, who sees people, who brings muffins to security guards and straightens bulletin boards when no one's looking." He stopped, a small smile curving at the corner of his mouth. "I started noticing, Emily, after that day, I paid attention. And what I saw was someone whose presence matters even if the world hasn't told her that enough." Emily's breath caught slightly in her chest. There it was again, that unexpected sting, not from his words, but from the aching part of her that wanted to believe them. She looked down at her folded napkin, then up at him, then back at the candle between them, the flame swaying ever so gently in the draft from the nearby door. 5 minutes had passed. She knew it. And yet, she didn't want to leave. Not yet. "Okay," she said, her voice barely louder than the clink of a spoon on porcelain at the next table. "You've used your 5 minutes." James straightened slightly, as if preparing to be dismissed, but she wasn't finished. "And I'm still here?" He exhaled not dramatically, but like someone letting go of a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time that evening, his smile reached his eyes. They didn't speak for a moment after that. There was no need. Something unspoken had already shifted between them, not dramatic, not sudden, but sure. A waiter appeared, discreet and kind. "Would you like to order?" he asked. James glanced at her. Emily nodded once, slowly. "Yes," she said. "Let's stay." And just like that, the spell deepened not with fireworks, but with quiet consent. The evening unfolded like a well-loved novel, familiar in rhythm, but rich in meaning. They talked about books, about their childhoods, about places they dreamed of visiting, and meals they missed from people long gone. James shared that he once built birdhouses with his grandfather. Emily admitted she kept a gratitude journal not every day, but enough. They laughed once, when the waiter spilled a drop of wine and apologized profusely. James handed him a napkin with a wink. Emily whispered, "He looks more nervous than us." And still, neither of them reached for their phones. Not once. The restaurant slowly emptied. Chairs scraped gently against wood floors. The jazz trio began to pack up. The candles burned lower, and still, they stayed. It wasn't the wine or the candlelight. It was the way he listened like no one else had. It surprised Emily how easy it was to forget the world beyond their table. The soft jazz had long faded, and most of the other diners had left. But here, tucked into the quiet corner of River and Oak. It still felt like the evening was just beginning. James Whitaker wasn't saying much anymore. He was listening, not the kind of listening that waits for an opening to speak, but the kind that makes you feel like the air is softer around your words, the kind that holds space. Emily hadn't meant to talk about her mother. It had been nearly 6 years, but the ache came back sharp sometimes, especially in the autumn, when the air smelled like cinnamon and old quilts, and she remembered the nights they would watch old movies wrapped in shared blankets. She was strong, Emily said, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. Not in the way that demands attention, just in the way she showed up for people. Every time, James didn't interrupt. Emily glanced at him, expecting the polite nod or the soft murmur people give when they don't know what to say. But he didn't look away, didn't check his watch. He just waited, his eyes steady and open. She passed quickly. She continued. Lung cancer. She never smoked a day in her life, but still, her voice caught, but she didn't stop. Afterward, the house felt so quiet I couldn't stand it. That's why I moved. That's why I keep my life small, safe. There was no pity in James's face, just understanding. And the winters, she added, after a pause. Those are the worst, the holidays especially. You'd think a grown woman would have figured out how to handle loneliness by now. James's brow softened. You'd be surprised how many of us haven't, he said. And then slowly, carefully he began to share his own story. My house is beautiful, he said, almost like a confession. 5 bedrooms, fireplace, gourmet kitchen. But most nights, it's just me, reheating something from the microwave and scrolling through emails I don't need to answer. Emily tilted her head, surprised by his candor. I used to think success would fill the silence, he continued. The more I achieved, the less it would echo. But it's louder than ever. He looked down at the tablecloth, fingers gently tapping a rhythm only he could hear. I was married once, nearly 10 years. We were young, she was kind, but we grew in different directions. Or maybe I stopped growing. I buried myself in the company. She needed someone who came home for dinner. I kept staying late. His voice didn't tremble, but it thinned out like he'd told this story before, but never fully let it land. She left, he said simply, and I didn't fight hard enough to make her stay. Emily studied him. In that moment, she didn't see a CEO. She didn't see the man whose signature could change people's futures. She saw someone tired of pretending he was fine. You don't seem like the type who's used to being this open, she said softly. I'm not, James admitted, a small smile tugging at his lips. But I also don't usually have dinner with someone who reminds me what honesty sounds like. They sat in stillness for a moment, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for more, but quietly gives permission to just be outside. The river shimmered under the glow of hanging lamps along the boardwalk. A few pedestrians strolled by, their laughter muted by glass. Inside, James and Emily remained in their pocket of shared quiet, a place where job titles and life armor had gently slipped away. Eventually, the waiter approached one last time, a bit sheepish. We're closing soon, he said. Take your time, just thought you might want to know. James nodded. Thank you. And the food was excellent. Emily smiled at that, especially the bread pudding. They both stood slowly, reluctant in that silent, mutual way people are when they've stumbled into something unexpectedly good. Outside the restaurant, the night air had cooled. A soft breeze lifted the edges of Emily's scarf, and she wrapped it a little tighter. James reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small white card. It wasn't his business card, not the glossy, embossed kind his assistant kept in neat stacks. This one was handwritten, plain, simple. He handed it to her. Emily turned it over. It was his name, a phone number, and beneath it, in his handwriting, call me if you believe this wasn't just dinner. She looked up. His expression was quiet, not hopeful, not expectant, just real, as if he was offering her not a challenge, but a choice. I won't call, she said softly, unless I mean it. I wouldn't want you to, he replied. They stood for a beat longer. Then he stepped back, gave a small nod, and walked toward his car, not rushing, not looking back. Emily stood alone on the sidewalk, the card still in her hand. She didn't put it away. She just stood there, breathing in the night. Some nights stay with you, not because of what was said, but because of what was finally felt. It was nearly midnight when Emily Harper stepped back into her apartment. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet only old buildings knew, where the creak of each floorboard seemed to carry stories from years past. She slipped off her shoes near the door, hung up her scarf, and turned on the soft lamp by the window. Warm light spilled over familiar furniture, her grandmother's quilt folded on the armrest, a worn paperback left open on the coffee table, a candle that smelled faintly of vanilla and pine. Stillness surrounded her, but inside, nothing felt still. The night hadn't ended with a kiss. There was no sweeping declaration, no grand moment under a canopy of stars, and yet something in her had shifted. She walked to the kitchen on instinct, filled the kettle, and placed it on the stove. The hiss of the flame catching was the only sound in the room. As she waited for the water to boil, she reached for her phone. A blinking notification caught her eye, a voicemail left earlier by her best friend, Laura. Emily had forgotten to check it. She hesitated, thumb hovering above the play button, then pressed. Laura's voice filled the room, cheerful, a little too loud for the hour. Hey, just wanted to wish you good luck tonight. Daniel is such a sweetheart. I have a good feeling about this one. Text me everything. Unless it goes terribly, then just send an emoji. Love you. Emily smiled a tired, quiet smile. She'd forgotten what Laura sounded like when she was hopeful. But this night hadn't gone as planned. She hadn't met Daniel. She'd met someone else. Someone whose name was whispered in hallways and typed in headlines, but who, tonight, had simply been a man sitting across from her, listening like it mattered. The kettle began to whistle. She turned off the stove and poured hot water over a chamomile tea bag, watching the golden hue deepen in the cup. Then she walked slowly to the window, mug in hand, and looked out over Charleston's quiet streets. The city had fallen into its nighttime rhythm, porch lights flickering, breeze rustling the trees, the occasional car humming softly in the distance. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the card he had given her. His name, a number, and beneath it, just 7 handwritten words. Call me if you believe this wasn't just dinner. She traced the curve of his writing with her thumb. He hadn't pressed. He hadn't insisted. He had simply asked her to believe. And now, back in his own world, miles away, but closer than she expected, James Whitaker stood by the window of his home office, staring out into the dark. The view was different. His was high above the street, looking out across the Ashley River, city lights reflected in water that never truly slept. But despite the height, despite the distance, he, too, felt the weight of quiet. On his desk lay a stack of contracts, 6 unanswered emails, and a leather-bound planner open to Monday's meetings. But none of it held his attention. His fingers rested on the same card, the one she had tucked into her purse 2 nights ago. Emily Harper. He hadn't written anything else. No second number, no job title, just her name. The same name that had circled his mind since he stepped into that elevator. The same name that now lived somewhere beneath the surface of his day. He ran a hand across his jaw, unsure of what to do with the feeling that had settled in his chest. It wasn't obsession. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense. It was curiosity, paired with calm, and a kind of admiration that made him ache, in a way he didn't have words for. He hadn't realized how tired he was of being impressive. He just wanted to be seen, and for once he had been, by someone who hadn't asked for anything, who hadn't even known she was being watched. His phone vibrated softly on the desk. Not a call, just a calendar reminder. He silenced it and looked back out the window, where the wind stirred the trees below. And still. No call, just silence. 2 days passed. Emily went about her routines. She helped a junior associate with a late project. She made her famous blueberry muffins for the security team. She even called her sister just to hear a familiar voice. But James lingered in her thoughts like a song she didn't know the words to, but kept humming anyway. On the second evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed her apartment in amber light, she found herself standing by the kitchen counter, staring at the card once more. She didn't overthink it this time. She didn't dress it up in meaning or worry about what it could become. She just picked up her phone, dialed the number, and held her breath. It didn't even ring twice. Emily. His voice came through low, steady as if he'd been holding his phone for hours. She closed her eyes. "Yes," she said. "It's me." There was a pause, but not an uncertain one. A full one. And then gently James said, "I was hoping you'd call. When two quiet people start talking, something begins to bloom." It didn't happen all at once. It started with small things. A cup of coffee placed near her desk before the office filled up. A text on Sunday morning. "There's a book I think you'd like. Page 143 made me think of you." A quiet moment in the elevator when no words were exchanged, just a glance and the comfort of being known. Emily had always found her peace in solitude. James had spent years mistaking silence for strength. Now, in the quiet spaces between them, something gentle began to grow. They didn't call it anything, not yet, but it lived in the little choices, the ones people don't notice unless they're paying attention. Once a week, they met at a small bookstore cafe tucked away near the edge of town. The owner, a gray-haired woman with a fondness for lemon tea and jazz, never asked questions. She simply greeted them both by name and let them sit in the corner booth by the window. Sometimes they talked for an hour, other times they read side by side in contented quiet, no labels, no expectations. But between the pages of books and sips of warm tea, the distance between CEO and secretary began to blur, replaced instead by two people simply learning each other's rhythms. Still, Emily was cautious. At the firm, she kept her head down. She greeted everyone with her usual kindness. She worked late when needed, stayed behind to clean up after meetings no one remembered she organized. But she could feel the whispers coming. People sense things, especially in environments where power gathers in corners and conversations are weighed by what's unsaid. And it came, as she expected, one Tuesday afternoon. Margaret Denton, head of operations, summoned Emily into her office under the pretense of reviewing supply invoices. The room was cold, both in temperature and in tone. Margaret didn't mince words. "I've been hearing things," she said, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "About you and Mr. Whitaker?" Emily felt the heat rise behind her ears. She stayed composed. "I'd like to remind you," Margaret continued, "that professionalism is essential here. Personal entanglements can compromise perception, especially when it involves upper leadership." The implication wasn't subtle. Emily had always believed in honesty, even when it cost her comfort. So, she met Margaret's gaze and spoke with quiet firmness. "I understand the concern, but I assure you, nothing about my role or responsibilities has changed. I've worked hard here for years. I don't intend to stop now." Margaret tilted her head, surprised by Emily's poise. "I'm not here to judge, Miss Harper. Just be careful." Emily nodded, but inside, something shifted. She didn't want to be afraid of being seen. Later that evening, in James's study, she recounted the conversation. He listened, jaw tightening just slightly, the only sign of tension. "I can talk to her," he offered gently. Emily shook her head. "That's exactly what I don't want. I need to handle this as me, not someone protected by you." He leaned back, studying her for a moment, then smiled. "That's one of the reasons I admire you." She smiled too, but her heart still felt heavy. James stood and walked to the fireplace. He stared into the unlit logs for a moment, then turned. "Maybe it's time," he said. "Time for what?" "To stop hiding." Emily's breath caught. "It's not about shame," James said, as if reading her thoughts. "It's about truth. And if we want something real, it should live in the open. She didn't respond right away, but that night, when she left his house, she felt lighter. 2 weeks later, the firm held its quarterly staff gathering, a casual evening meant to build morale. Though most people attended for the wine and catered food, James rarely showed up to such events, which is why, when he entered the courtyard that evening, all conversation stopped. He wore no tie, his blazer was unbuttoned, and instead of standing apart, he walked directly into the crowd, shaking hands, smiling, making eye contact in a way that made even the most cynical staffers straighten up. Emily stood near the refreshment table, unsure of how to move, how to breathe. But then James looked across the courtyard, found her in the sea of faces, and without hesitation walked to her side. The moment stretched, people watched. Emily's pulse pounded. James simply reached for a drink, then turned to her and asked, "Would you like to join me on the terrace?" Just that. No declaration, no announcement, just a choice, extended with calm certainty. She nodded, and as they stepped away together, the buzz of conversation rose again, but it didn't matter, because for the first time, they weren't pretending. Somewhere between two people in a riverbank, life quietly changes course. The river hadn't changed. It still curled like a ribbon through the city, calm and unhurried, mirroring the burnt orange of the setting sun. Boats drifted past with soft hums, leaving behind ripples that gently kissed the rocks along the edge. But Emily had changed. She stood at the edge of the cobbled path, just where it began to slope gently toward the water. A light wind tugged at the hem of her coat. In her hands, she clutched gloves she hadn't bothered to wear. Her fingers were cold, but she didn't mind. Her heart was too full of questions to notice the chill. Ahead of her, James waited by the familiar riverside restaurant, the same place where, months ago, her world had quietly begun to tilt. He hadn't told her where they were going, just sent a short text, "Meet me at the place that started it all." And though she'd read those words over and over, she didn't need to wonder. Her feet had remembered the way long before her mind caught up. He stood near the wooden railing now, hands in his coat pockets, looking out over the river like it held answers. He turned when he heard her steps. Their eyes met, and for a moment, nothing else existed. "Hi," he said, quietly. "Hi," she replied. No other words came. They didn't need them yet. He gestured toward the table, the same one they had sat at on that unexpected first dinner, still tucked under the old iron lantern, still slightly wobbly in the back leg, still overlooking the slow stretch of water that seemed to listen more than it moved. A waiter approached with 2 mugs of mulled cider. James nodded in thanks, then wrapped his hands around his mug as if anchoring himself. "I wanted us to come back here," he began, his voice gentle, "because that night changed everything for me." Emily looked at him, really looked, and saw something new in his expression. Not the quiet confidence of a man used to being in control, not the guarded charm of a CEO balancing image and ambition. This was something else, earnest, unadorned. "I used to think I had everything I wanted," he continued, his gaze lowering. "A successful firm, a house that echoed with silence, a life that looked impressive in pictures." He paused, fingers curling around the warm ceramic. "But I didn't have this." She waited, heart pounding. "This." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "This stillness I feel when I'm with you. This sense that I don't have to be James Whittaker, founder and executive. I can just be a man, with hopes, with regrets, with soft places I don't show the world." The words caught in her chest. He stood then, slowly walking around the table. When he reached her side, he didn't kneel, didn't reach into his coat for a box. Instead, he reached for her hands. No grandeur, no performance, just 2 hands, warm and steady, holding hers like they had always belonged there. "I didn't come here tonight with a speech," he said, "just with a feeling I can't shake." He took a breath. "Emily Harper," he said softly. "Would you build a life with me?" She blinked, a single tear spilling before she could stop it. "I don't mean a perfect life," he continued. "Not the one in glossy magazines or 5-year plans. I mean the kind where we burn dinner and laugh about it, where we hold each other when the world feels heavy, where the lights are always on, even when the day has gone dark. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but emotion rose too fast, too full. So, she did what her heart had decided long ago. She nodded, not with hesitation, not with surprise, but with quiet certainty. Yes, she whispered, her voice catching on the wind. A pause. Then he pulled her gently into his arms. No applause, no cameras. Just the soft sounds of water below and wind in the trees bearing witness to a decision that had been slowly growing between them like ivy up a stone wall. They stood that way for a while, swaying slightly in the hush of twilight. Eventually, she pulled back, tears still clinging to her lashes. "I don't want a castle," she said softly. He smiled. "Good," he whispered, "because neither do I. I want late-night pancakes," she continued, voice steadier now, "and mismatched socks, and Saturday mornings in the garden, and a house that smells like cinnamon in winter." James leaned his forehead against hers. "I want a home," he said, "with you." She nodded again, a small laugh slipping past her lips. "Then let's build it," she whispered. "Not the castle, the life." He kissed her, then slow, certain like the river had taught them both the value of patience. They never wanted a perfect story, just a real one made of quiet moments that mattered. The ocean didn't roar near their house. It whispered. Waves pressed into the sand like careful footsteps, retreating with equal grace. Wind moved through seagrass with the softness of lullabies. And on the front porch of a modest cedar-shingled home, a golden retriever dozed at the feet of two people who had learned that peace isn't found in noise, but in the hush that follows choosing love. Again and again. Emily rocked gently in her chair, a warm mug of tea cupped between her palms. Morning sunlight stretched across the weathered floorboards, casting long shadows of the railing, striped like piano keys. The scent of sea salt mixed with rosemary from the clay pots beside her. Inside the house, James was humming off-key, as always as he prepared breakfast. The clatter of a pan and the creak of a cabinet felt like music to her now, a kind of ordinary symphony. 2 years had passed since the letter slipped from her hands, and in those 2 years, everything had changed, but not in the ways people might think. Yes, she had said yes to his quiet proposal. Yes, they had married not with fanfare or chandeliers, but with bare feet in the sand and handwritten vows exchanged under a pale blue sky. But what had truly changed wasn't their status or their address. It was how they lived, every Tuesday morning. Emily drove to the office of Reclaim, the nonprofit she'd founded for women, restarting careers after 40. What began as an idea scrawled on a napkin had grown into a warm, bustling place filled with second chances and shelves lined with donated heels, laptops, and hope. She met women who had raised children, nursed parents, fought battles no resume could explain, and she listened to their stories like sacred texts. James, for his part, still ran Whitaker and Knox, though now with a stronger delegation and a sharper line between urgent and important. He left the office by 5 most days. He no longer lived for quarterly reports, but for porch dinners and late-night puzzles, for Emily's laughter when he forgot where he set his glasses, and for the way she tucked her feet under his on cold nights. Some weekends, they drove into Charleston for jazz and bookstores. Other times, they simply walked the beach and watched the sky shift colors, saying little, needing less. The world had stopped asking how a secretary ended up with a CEO. The answer had become irrelevant, because titles had never been the point. Love, as they had discovered, was not a ladder, it was a garden. And gardens bloom best when no one's keeping score. One Friday afternoon, as autumn curled around the coastline, Emily stood in the small sunlit kitchen, slicing apples for a pie. The phone buzzed. A name flashed on the screen. Karen. She hadn't spoken with her former department head in over a year. There had been tension, certainly suspicion about her relationship with James, a coldness that lingered long after the truth was known. Emily hesitated, then answered, "Emily, Karen's voice was softer than she remembered. I heard about Reclaim. I just wanted to say it's a beautiful thing you're doing. Emily blinked, caught off guard. Thank you, she said. It means a lot to hear that. A pause. Then Karen added, I've been mentoring a woman returning to work after a long break. She's remarkable, and she's scared. Would you consider meeting her? Emily smiled gently, a warmth rising in her chest. Of course, she said. And just like that. A quiet knot, one she didn't realize still tugged at her, loosened. That evening, as the sun folded itself into the horizon, James lit the lanterns along the porch. Their dog, Max, trotted past with a stick in his mouth, proud as a prince. Emily stepped outside with the pie, the scent of cinnamon trailing behind her. They sat down, hands brushing as they passed silverware and stories. Do you ever think about that letter, she asked, not looking up. James chuckled softly. All the time. I used to think I was foolish for writing it, she admitted. He turned to her. And I thank God every day you did. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but sacred. After dinner, they sat in their rocking chairs, a shared blanket across their laps, Max asleep at their feet. The stars began to appear, one by one, as if being carefully hung by invisible hands. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn, faded, familiar, her letter, the same one she thought she'd lost forever. I've kept it, he said. Every word still matters. Emily took it, eyes stinging. She ran her fingers over the ink, her own handwriting, hopeful and unguarded. It didn't feel like a different version of herself. It felt like the beginning of them. She smiled. I never wanted to change the world, she said. James looked over. You did, he said, mine, on a porch by the sea, where tides rise and fall like the rhythm of breath. Two people sat not in a castle, not in a dream, but in a life stitched gently together by quiet mornings, honest conversations, and a letter that had never meant to be found. And sometimes, that's more than enough. Sometimes, what changes our lives forever doesn't come with noise or grand gestures. It arrives quietly in the form of a handwritten letter, a soft conversation, or the courage to stay for 5 more minutes. Emily and James didn't find love through perfect timing or ideal circumstances. They found it through vulnerability, by showing up, by listening, and by choosing kindness when it would have been easier to walk away. For those of us who have lived long enough to carry heartbreak, disappointment, or long seasons of silence, this story is a gentle reminder. It's never too late to begin again. You're never too old to be seen, truly seen by someone who values what the world often overlooks. Love doesn't always arrive in fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in silence and stays in the quiet moments that follow. So, whether you're writing your first letter or answering one that's long been waiting, trust that your story still matters and that the right heart will hear it, even if it falls by accident. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it today, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Your support helps us keep telling the quiet stories that matter.